3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
So I'm the only person on this stage who has prosecuted transnational criminal organizations for the trafficking of guns, drugs, and human beings.
This is a clip from last night's presidential debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. As a former district attorney and attorney general, Vice President Harris presents her policies as tough on crime. But is that really the case? Today, I sat down with Heritage Senior Legal Fellow Zack Smith to discuss his take on this claim. Zack Smith, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
So last night we watched the debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. And in light of your expertise, was there anything in that debate that stood out to you?
Well, there was a lot that stood out to me, whether it's in my area of expertise or not. But, certainly there were a few references to Kamala Harris's past as a prosecutor, a few references to her positions on issues like defunding the police. And I think it was very clear to me the way that she is messaging her positions on many of those issues today, whether it's during her time as vice president or, elsewhere. The way she's messaging many of her positions today do not match how she has messaged her positions on many criminal justice issues in the past. And certainly the way she is messaging her positions today do not match her very radical record on many of these issues.
So she's billed herself as the former district attorney. She was
she was San Francisco's district attorney for several years. She then moved on to become California's attorney general before she became a U.S. senator and then ultimately vice president. And what's interesting is during her time as district attorney and California's attorney general, she's referred to herself repeatedly as California's or San Francisco's top cop because she is the district attorney. She was the district attorney or attorney general in those jurisdictions.
How has her record compared to how she bills herself today?
Her record is very radical. In fact, I just had a Heritage backgrounder come out talking about Kamala Harris's pro-crime policies and doing a deep dive into that record. But it's very clear she has always taken a very far left view of our criminal justice system. She's taken many soft on crime policy stances that have ultimately ended up harming the communities where those policies have been enacted. And I'm happy to talk about some of those today.
Yeah, please do.
So if we look at her record, obviously, today she refers to herself as a pragmatic prosecutor instead of a progressive prosecutor. That's very different than what she was saying just a few years ago, where she proudly referred to her progressive prosecutorial record. And she has ties to the progressive prosecutor movement. Of course, we refer to it as the rogue prosecutor movement. But she's also implemented policies during her time as San Francisco's district attorney, during her time as California's attorney general, that did not work to keep those communities safe. And I'll give a couple of examples. For instance, she touted one of her programs that she implemented during her time as San Francisco's district attorney. It's called the Back on Track program. Essentially, it was designed to allow low-level offenders to get rehabilitation services, to help them find employment, and if they successfully completed the program, their record would be expunged. Well, it turned out she was actually allowing illegal aliens to participate in this program. And this shameful on many levels, but particularly because what was happening is illegal aliens who are not eligible to work in this country were actually getting job services, other resources that they were never eligible to receive. And yet this was something that her office had signed off on. These were people that her office had placed into this program, and yet she never took responsibility for that until it came out while she was running for California's attorney general.
You mentioned the progressive or the rogue prosecutor movement.
Right.
You are uniquely situated to speak on that because you, along with Heritage Fellow Cully Stimson, wrote a book on that topic. Can you just briefly give us an idea, what is the progressive prosecutor movement and how does Kamala Harris tie in?
Yeah, so many cities around the country now have these so-called progressive prosecutors in office. It's basically the idea that the local elected district attorney can refuse to do his or her job, refuse to enforce laws that their state's legislature has enacted, and decide what crimes to charge, and essentially by doing that, nullify certain areas of the criminal code. And so you may have heard in places like Chicago with Kim Foxx, she unilaterally raised the threshold for felony theft much, much higher than the Illinois state legislature had set that. There are entire categories of crimes that many of these prosecutors declined to prosecute. Many of these prosecutors have said they will never seek the death penalty, even if their state legislature authorizes it, even if particularly heinous crimes have been committed. And Kamala Harris has been very sympathetic to all of these policies. In fact, if you go back to her time as San Francisco's district attorney, she campaigned on a pledge never to seek the death penalty. And there was one particular case where a police officer was executed, his partner was severely injured as well, that the death penalty was certainly warranted. That's what many in the community felt was appropriate punishment for this offender. That's what the officers' families felt were appropriate punishment for this offender. And in fact, that's even what then Senators Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer felt was an appropriate punishment, the death penalty, because this act was so heinous. And yet Kamala Harris refused to seek the death penalty in that case. And what's interesting about it is at the time she gave conflicting rationales for why she refused to seek the death penalty. At one point, she said she was essentially fulfilling a campaign promise to never seek the death penalty. And yet when she started getting pushback, even from very prominent politicians like Dianne Feinstein or Barbara Boxer, she then changed course and said, well, she reviews the evidence, taken some time to consider it, and didn't think the death penalty would be appropriate. And so she's always been very anti-death penalty. Now, in terms of the rogue prosecutor movement itself, a lot of people don't realize this. When Kamala Harris was a senator-elect, still serving as California's Attorney General at the same time, she actually co-chaired Kim Foxx's transition committee. Kim Foxx is currently the state's attorney, essentially the local district attorney in Cook County, Illinois, in Chicago. And Kamala Harris helped author Kim Foxx's transition report, which outlined many of the radical policies that Kim Foxx would then go on to implement for Cook County and the city of Chicago. And what's interesting about that report, the report doesn't focus on Chicago's very violent crime rate. The report does not focus on the gang problem that Chicago is currently suffering from. Instead, the report focuses by and large on racial justice issues. It talks about the systemic racism of our criminal justice system, which is a fallacy for many reasons. Cully and I have talked about that elsewhere. But it also focuses on the need to retrain attorneys to increase the diversity, and by that it means the racial diversity of the assistant prosecutors in the office, the need to train them on implicit bias, the ways that all of us are supposedly biased but don't realize it, and those types of social issues instead of focusing on tackling the violent crime rate in Chicago. The other thing I'll quickly mention, Mark, is some people may remember, I think we've talked about before, Rachel Rollins. She was the rogue district attorney in Suffolk County, Boston, Massachusetts. She actually put out a list of 15 crimes you could commit in Boston that she would not prosecute you for. And just to give you an example what that looks like in practice, under Rachel Rollins' list of 15 crimes, someone could break into your house, be in possession of cocaine, and then resist arrest when the police showed up. And Rachel Rollins said she wouldn't prosecute you for any of those crimes so long as you said you initially broke into the home to find food or shelter or something along those lines. Well, her reward for these radical policies was the Biden-Harris administration nominated her to be the U.S. attorney for the entire state of Massachusetts. That's the chief federal law enforcement officer for the entire state, the chief federal prosecutor there in Massachusetts. Now, typically, United States attorneys' nominations are fairly uncontroversial. They typically do not receive much time on the Senate floor, and they typically go through fairly uncontroversially. That wasn't the case with Rachel Rollins. Her nomination was so controversial because her policies were so radical that there was actually substantial debate on the floor. Senator Tom Cotton gave a very impassioned speech speaking out against many of her policies. And her policies were so bad that the Senate actually split 50-50 on whether or not to confirm her to be the U.S. attorney. Guess who cast the tie-breaking vote to confirm Rachel Rollins? Kamala Harris as vice president. Well, how did that work out? not so well. It turned out Rachel Rollins committed a number of ethical violations while she was U.S. Attorney. The Justice Department Inspector General actually issued a blistering report detailing many of those ethical violations. And in fact, the Justice Department Inspector General actually referred her for criminal prosecution to the Biden-Harris Main Justice Department for lying to their investigators during the course of this investigation. Now, of course, the Justice Department did not pursue criminal charges, but I think it's important to understand this is the person that Kamala Harris cast the tie-breaking vote to confirm to that position.
There was an exchange during the debate in which the issue of the national crime rate went up, and Vice President Harris, as well as one of the ABC moderators, confusingly, suggested that it actually had gone down over the course of the Biden and Harris administration. Trump pointed out that the data being cited omitted several key cities.
Right.
What did you take from that exchange, and what would you expect to potentially see based on how crime has behaved in the Biden administration and going into a future potential Harris administration?
Right. So I think it's important to understand upfront that violent crime is absolutely a problem that many in our country are facing today. And Kamala Harris's policies will do nothing but flame the fires that are driving that surge in violent crime rates. Now, in terms of crime statistics, this can be sometimes a little bit of a wonky subject. It can be difficult to understand. I think part of that may be on purpose for many of the folks who are responsible for collecting and disseminating this data. But what I would say is it's important to understand what the folks at the debate were talking about last night were national crime rates. Crime is predominantly a localized phenomena. And so the national crime rate really doesn't tell us much about what's happening in certain cities or localities. And crime is a hyper-localized phenomenon. And so, for instance, we've heard people talk about state-level crime data in the past as well, which also doesn't tell us much because crime is so localized. So, for instance, if you take the city of Chicago out of Illinois' crime rate, Illinois' murder rate drops by almost 50%. I don't think that will come as a surprise, but you'll see that repeated around the country as well. If you take St. Louis out of Missouri's murder rate will plummet, and so on and so on. And so really, if we want to get a picture of what's happening, we need to look at local crime data. Now, in terms of national crime data, there was a debate about the FBI and how they collect their crime statistics. The FBI changed the way they collect and report their crime statistics several years ago. When they talked about certain cities not reporting their data, that was due in part to that change. It made it much more difficult, much more onerous for local police departments to collect their data, send it to the FBI, and report it. And so the FBI has been estimating crime where they're lacking certain information. Those estimates appear to be off in many instances, severely underestimating the amount of violent crime. And the reason we know that is because there's another survey tool that's often used, the National Crime Victimization Survey. And if you look at the numbers of reported violent crime that the FBI crime statistics are reporting, and you look at the crime that is self-reported from the National Crime Victim Survey, the self-reported violent crime experiences of individuals who are part of that survey is much, much higher than the reported crime statistics from the FBI. And so that's some of the disconnect that was happening at the debate right now. I think it's clear there are many issues with the way the FBI is currently collecting and reporting crime statistics. It seems like they're systemically underreporting violent crime in many instances. And so this is certainly an issue that any administration will need to address. But I doubt that with the way it's being weaponized right now, reported favorably for the Biden-Harris administration, I doubt that will be a top priority for their administration. The other thing I'd quickly say, Mark, is that violent crime may have ticked down in some cities this past year, but it's important to look at the crime trend over the past 4 to 5 years, certainly pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd riots in many instances. And if you look at the crime statistics over the past 4 to 5 year period, we had such a huge spike after the summer of 2020 that even if the violent crime rates have ticked down slightly in some cities, they're still much, much higher than they were 4 to 5 years ago.
Something you mentioned. Another piece of Vice President Harris's record on justice, which has drawn a lot of attention, is in that period following the summer of 2020.
Right.
Of course, she supported the Minnesota Freedom Fund, bailing out rioters who were involved in some of the social unrest that happened in that period of time. What do you think that says about her policy preferences?
Well, I think it shows she has a very radical view of our criminal justice system. She's bought into this idea that our criminal justice system is systemically racist, that essentially she has focused on offenders and their needs instead of the needs of the community, the needs of victims. And in my report, I detail some of the folks that were actually beneficiaries of that Minnesota Freedom Fund. And these were people accused of very violent crimes, people accused often of committing very heinous crimes, such as child sex offenses, that were actually bailed out and returned to the street. And if you go through and look at some of these specific instances in my backgrounder report, several of those individuals were in fact, again, subsequently arrested for committing very violent crimes such as murder. And these were the individuals that Kamala Harris was encouraging her supporters to essentially help her bail out of jail there in Minnesota. The other thing I would say, if you look at some of the statements she made during the summer of 2020, she said that it was outdated thinking, that putting more police on the street would help keep communities safe. Now, that's clearly wrong. One of the most effective things state and local leaders can do to help keep their communities safe is put more police on the streets and empower them to responsibly do their jobs. And yet that's not what Kamala Harris was saying at that time. Now, what's interesting about that, if we go back to 2009, she wrote a book while she was still San Francisco's district attorney called Smart on Crime. And I think it's interesting to compare her statements in the summer of 2020 to one of the statements she made in that 2009 Smart on Crime book. And I'll read you what she wrote in 2009. She said, quote, "If we take a show of hands of those who would like to see more police officers on the street, mine would shoot up. A more visible and strategic presence is a deterrent to crime, and it has a positive impact on a community. Virtually all law-abiding citizens feel safer when they see officers walking a beat. This is as true in economically poor neighborhoods as in wealthy ones. Police officers are a reassuring sign of a community's commitment to order, calm, and safety. More beat cops means more rapid response to assaults, traffic crimes, and robberies, and has a profound effect on reducing quality of life crimes by simple presence." That is an accurate statement of the effect that police have on communities. What's interesting is how radical Kamala Harris's, at least the way she messages her position on police officers and funding police officers, how radical a shift has occurred between 2009 and today, or the summer of 2020, when she was making those statements. And in fact, if you go back to the summer of 2020, not only was she calling her own alleged prior positions as outdated and misguided thinking, she is also actively supporting efforts to defund the police. When then LA Mayor Eric Garcetti pledged to cut about $150 million from the LA Police Department's budget, she said she was essentially proud of Mayor Garcetti and that she was very supportive of that effort. And so it's very interesting to see how she has messaged her positions differently as the political winds have shifted.
Some on the left have tried to portray Kamala Harris as being tough on crime due to her record as district attorney persecuting marijuana convictions.
Right.
What's your take on that?
I think that's a misguided effort to paint her as tough on crime. Certainly, again, her position on marijuana policy, marijuana prosecutions has supposedly evolved as she has ascended the ranks from San Francisco's district attorney to a U.S. senator to then vice president. Today, she is very supportive of those who seek to expunge convictions for prior marijuana offenses. She's supported blanket pardons for those who have been federally convicted of marijuana simple possession offenses. She's tried to lead efforts to reschedule marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act and taken other efforts in that vein. Now, when she was San Francisco's district attorney, it is true she did prosecute approximately 1,900 people for marijuana-related offenses. This is often what you were referring to, pointed to by people on the left to show that she was supposedly a tough-on-crime prosecutor. That's not true. I'll read you a quote, a different quote from someone who is knowledgeable of what was happening at that time. This person said, marijuana sales cases were routinely reduced to misdemeanors, and marijuana possession cases were not even on the court's docket. They were simply not charged. Unless there was a large grow case or a unique circumstance, this was the reform-minded approach then DA Harris's office took. The accusations about marijuana prosecutions being harsh during her tenure are absurd. absurd. The reality was quite the opposite. And this was someone who is sympathetic to Kamala Harris and her position on marijuana-related offenses. They were trying to defend her with that quote. But I think it goes to show that she has always been very radical and always sympathetic to those who are seeking to avoid prosecution for even harmful offenses like drug possession.
Some have raised concerns about potential ethical violations during her time as district attorney. Have you found that to be substantive?
Yeah, in my backgrounder report, I detail several instances, both during her time as district attorney and during her time as California's attorney general. And there was one particularly egregious incident while she was San Francisco's district attorney. There was a lab technician who was committing misconduct on the job, was essentially stealing some of the drugs that had come into the lab to be tested for her own personal use. And whenever the lab technicians, the police, and the district attorneys found this out, they didn't inform criminal defendants and their defense counsels as they're supposed to. There's a Supreme Court case known as Brady that essentially says defendants are constitutionally entitled to receive certain exculpatory information that could help them in their defense. And this is standard fare. Any prosecutor in the United States knows the importance of turning over Brady material. And yet Kamala Harris's office didn't do that. And when this issue was raised before a judge, the judge was flabbergasted that despite the fact that Kamala Harris had been in office for many years at that point, her office had no written policy to deal with these types of issues, to deal with these Brady issues when they came up, to help prosecutors and defense attorneys know what the procedures and processes would be to make sure that all relevant information had been turned over. Now, what's ironic about this lab technician's file, whenever this was processed through, there was actually a note on her file that said Brady implications, flagging that this could lead to problems in the future. Now, what happened in this case, because Kamala Harris's office botched this very important issue so badly, somewhere between 600 to 1,000 drug-related cases had to be dismissed by her office. There are also several instances while she was California's Attorney General where she defended prosecutorial misconduct that had happened in the trial court level. And again, that's something that should trouble everyone, either on the left or the right. And it just goes to show that not only does Kamala Harris have very radical policy positions on many criminal justice issues, she also made several questionable decisions during her time both as district attorney and as attorney general.
Zack Smith, thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks to Zack Smith for his contributions to this episode. You can follow Zack on X at @TZSmith. You can also find his backgrounder, Kamala Harris's pro-crime policies, at heritage.org. It's also linked in the show notes. And of course, thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Heritage Explains is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. It's written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp. Production assistance by Alexa Walker and Jeff Smith.